Imagine a frozen valley at the edge of Montana where silence weighs heavier than the snow itself. A lonely war veteran sits by his fire, believing he's left the world behind, until three slow knocks echo through the storm. On his doorstep stands a German shepherd, her fur frozen, her eyes fierce, guarding two trembling pups. What follows is not just survival, but a rediscovery of faith, courage, and grace in the heart of winter. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? I'd love to know how far this story of hope will travel. The town of Ravenhill, tucked deep in the northern reaches of Montana, was known for two things: silence and snow. The kind of silence that hummed like a hymn between pine trees, and the kind of snow that turned roads into memories. That night, the temperature sank to -30, and the world looked bleached. White hills upon white roofs upon white breath. Inside a small log cabin halfway up the slope, an old man named Eli Turner sat alone by the fireplace, his world measured by the crackle of burning wood and the ticking of an antique clock. Eli was 63, broad-shouldered but lean, with skin weathered by years of wind and war. His hair, once dark as coffee, now carried the color of frost. A faint scar cut across his left temple, a memory from Fallujah, though he rarely spoke of it. He had the posture of a man who'd learned to listen to silence, and the eyes of one who'd seen too much of it. On the cabin wall hung a hunting rifle that hadn't fired in years, and beside it, a small wooden cross carved by his mother before she died. It was the only thing that looked tender in that rugged room. Eli wasn't unkind, just wary. He'd once been a U.S. Marine sergeant, decorated, respected, then quietly broken by what he'd brought home: insomnia, echoes, and a habit of speaking to the empty chair across the table. In Ravenhill, solitude was not punishment, but shelter. He rarely went into town except for supplies, and the locals spoke of him with a kind of respectful distance. The mailman, a young man named Ryder, once said Eli looked like a man who carried invisible luggage, heavy but carefully packed. That night, the storm came early. The wind pushed against the cabin like something alive. Snow swirled in mad, relentless patterns, rattling windows, clawing at the roof. Eli stoked the fire and poured himself a cup of black coffee that smelled faintly of burnt hope. The storm didn't frighten him. Nothing really did anymore, but it made him uneasy because storms in Ravenhill had a way of bringing things to your door. And then it happened. 3 knocks, not frantic, not pleading. 3 slow, deliberate taps, spaced like heartbeat pauses. Eli froze, the mug halfway to his lips. He waited, listening. The wind moaned, then stilled, as if holding its breath. 3 knocks again. He reached for the rifle out of habit, then stopped halfway. His eyes flicked toward the cross. "Don't test me tonight," he murmured under his breath. He set the cup down, walked to the door, and cracked it open. The storm exploded inward. Snow and wind swirled around him in a white frenzy, biting his skin. Through the blur of flurries, he saw her, a German shepherd, standing firm against the wind, her fur matted with ice, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Behind her, 2 tiny pups pressed against her legs, trembling. She was big, muscular under the winter coat, but her ribs showed through. A mother running, on willpower. Her eyes were amber, sharp and alert, yet tired in a way that only mothers who've seen hunger could be. Eli stared. The dog stared back. It wasn't a look of begging. It was a kind of calculation, measuring if he was worth trusting. He hesitated. A single heartbeat stretched into eternity. Then he muttered, "Well, hell with it," and unlatched the door wider. "Come in." The dog stepped forward, cautious but resolute. Snow followed her in, a pale ghost settling on the wooden floor. The 2 pups stumbled after her, clumsy and adorable, their fur damp and soft as smoke. The mother positioned herself instantly between Eli and her young, body low, ready to defend. He admired that. It was the same stance soldiers used when covering the wounded. "Easy there," Eli said softly, voice gravelly but kind. "You're not my enemy tonight." He grabbed a towel from a hook near the fire, laid it by the hearth, and gestured. The dog's ears twitched, and after a long second, she guided her pups toward the warmth. The firelight painted their wet fur in shades of gold and copper. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive, like it had taken a breath. Eli poured water into an old metal bowl, placing it gently near them. The larger pup, curious and wobbly, sniffed the bowl, then turned and inspected one of Eli's boots, a cracked leather relic from his Marine days. The pup wrinkled his tiny nose, sneezed, and barked once as if voicing disapproval. Eli blinked, then chuckled, a dry, surprised sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. "Hey, I saved your tail from freezing. You can review the accommodations later, kid." The mother tilted her head, watching him with quiet intelligence. When she finally lowered her body to the towel, it was not surrender, but acceptance. One pup crawled under her neck. The other nestled against her side. Their breathing synced, a slow, fragile rhythm that felt sacred. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, time softened. Eli crouched beside them, cautious but drawn in. He noticed a faint scar across the dog's right ear, as if from a wire or snare. "Been through hell too, huh?" he whispered. "Guess we've both done some surviving." The firelight flickered across his face and hers, two silhouettes, man and beast, both marked by the same battle called loneliness. For a long while, he simply watched them sleep. The crackling fire, the muffled wind, the small sounds of paws twitching in dream, all of it blended into something that resembled peace. He found himself talking, though no one asked him to. "My mother used to say the Lord sends you company when you least expect it, usually in forms that bite or bark." He looked toward the cross. "You're late, Ma, but I'll take the hint." The night stretched on. The snow kept falling, and in that small cabin, surrounded by cold and silence, Eli Turner rediscovered warmth not from the fire, but from faith disguised as fur. When the flames burned low, he stood, tossed another log in, and checked the window. The blizzard had swallowed the world outside. He could see nothing but white, endless, shifting white. Yet, for the first time in years, he didn't feel swallowed by it. He looked at the mother dog, whose eyes flicked open at his movement, alert, protective. "I'll call you later," he murmured, "if you stay." Her gaze softened. She didn't move, but the message was clear. "I already have." Eli sat back in his chair, one hand resting loosely near his knee, the other holding his coffee now gone cold. The fire hummed, the pups dreamed, and outside, the mountain slept under its silver shroud. For a man who had spent a lifetime guarding doors, tonight he'd opened one, and it had changed everything. Morning did not so much arrive in Ravenhill as it crept in, pale and cautious. The storm had eased, leaving the world glazed in white and quiet. Snow draped the pine branches like robes of mourning, and the horizon shimmered faintly under a cold sun that seemed unsure of its welcome. Inside the cabin, Eli Turner stirred awake in his chair. His coffee was frozen at the rim of the cup, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The room smelled of smoke, wet fur, and a faint sweetness of thawing pine sap. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed the whole thing, the dog, the pups, the storm. But then he heard it, the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing. The German shepherd lay curled near the hearth, her body curved protectively around her two pups. The light from the embers gave her fur a copper tint. She had the calm watchfulness of something both wild and maternal, a creature forged from instinct and endurance. Eli leaned forward, studying her. There was frost clinging to her whiskers, a line of small scars across her front leg, and a faint cloud of breath escaping her nose with each exhale. When one of the pups whimpered, she lifted her head immediately, eyes sharp but soft, amber and intelligent, like molten honey that refused to harden. The smaller pup was the weaker one, its ribs faint beneath the fur, trembling as it tried to nuzzle closer. Eli's voice, rough from sleep, broke the silence. "You've got some fighters there." The dog's ears twitched. She didn't move, but her gaze followed him as he stood, stretched, and poured water from a kettle into a metal pot. Steam hissed. The sound felt too loud for the fragile peace inside the cabin. Eli wasn't a man used to company, certainly not the kind that breathed and wagged its tail. His life since leaving the Marines had been measured in seasons of solitude. The silence had become both companion and curse. But now that silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It breathed. He warmed a rag near the fire, crouched down, and gently rubbed the weak pup's body. "Hang in there, little one," he murmured. The pup's tail gave a small, uncertain twitch. The mother dog watched every motion, her muscles tight, but she didn't interfere. Trust, Eli realized, was a kind of surrender, and she was granting him that. A sudden knock startled him. 2 quick raps, then one softer. He frowned, half expecting the wind, but this rhythm was human. When he opened the door, a wave of cold air burst in, along with a tall figure wrapped in a dark green parka and a red woolen scarf. "Morning, Eli," said Grace Holloway, her voice muffled but familiar. Grace was in her early 40s, tall and slender, her long hair braided beneath her hood. Her cheeks glowed pink from the cold, and her eyes, gray-blue, sharp and calm, seemed to absorb everything they saw. She was the kind of woman who carried both warmth and caution in the same glance. Life in Ravenhill had carved that balance into her. Grace had lost her husband, Tom Holloway, years ago to a hunting accident, or at least that's what people called it. He'd been found near the ravine, rifle snapped in 2, footprints suggesting something had startled him before he fell. Since then, Grace had lived alone on a small ranch down the valley, tending to sheep, horses, and the occasional lost soul. Loss had taught her kindness, but also vigilance. "Morning," Eli replied, stepping aside. "You shouldn't be out in this cold." Grace shrugged, brushing snow off her shoulders. "You know I don't listen to warnings. Besides, I heard something last night. Sounded like an animal crying near your ridge." Her eyes darted to the fireplace. "Looks like I wasn't hearing ghosts after all." She smiled faintly at the sight of the dog and pups. "A German shepherd, huh? Beautiful. Thin, though?" She bent slightly, keeping her distance. The dog growled low. Not a threat, more like a reminder. "It's okay, girl," Grace said softly. Her voice gentled, carrying that rural patience that comes from talking to animals more often than people. "You've got babies to guard. I get it." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small jar of golden honey. "This might help," she said, placing it on the table. "When one of our lambs got weak last winter, a spoonful of this got him breathing again. Old farm trick." Eli lifted a brow. "You planning to baptize him with sugar?" Grace smirked. "If it works, you can call it whatever gospel you want." He scooped a drop of honey onto his fingertip and touched it gently to the pup's lips. For a second, nothing. Then a faint lick, hesitant, but real. The pup's tiny tongue caught the sweetness, then again, stronger this time. Its breathing deepened. Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "See," she whispered. "Told you. Sometimes miracles just need a little help from bees." Eli smiled. "A rare, unguarded thing. You and your country magic." She glanced toward the wooden cross on the wall, the one Eli never touched but never moved. "Not mine," she said quietly. "His." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Outside, wind rustled the snow-laden trees. Inside, firelight danced on fur and wood, and the silver lines of memory etched on Eli's face. Grace took off her gloves and crouched beside him. "You plan to keep them?" He hesitated. "For now, till the storm passes." She nodded. "They'll need milk, warmth, maybe a vet. Closest one's in town, 12 miles downhill. Roads will be frozen till noon." "I'll manage," Eli said. His tone carried the stubbornness of a man used to managing everything alone. "I know," Grace said, standing. "That's what worries me." Before she left, she laid a hand on the doorframe, eyes softening. "If you need anything, blankets, medicine, prayers, you know where I am." Eli almost replied, but the words tangled. Instead, he nodded. When the door closed, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It felt alive, like the cabin had learned to breathe again. The dog shifted her weight, licking her pups, then turned her head toward Eli. He caught her gaze and said quietly, "Guess it's just us again, Guardian." The name slipped out without thought, but once said, it felt right. Guardian. The protector. The sentinel in the snow. The rest of the day passed in small acts of repair. Eli chopped wood, fixed the draft in the window, melted snow for water. Guardian watched every move, sometimes resting her head on her paws, sometimes rising when he stepped too close to the pups. It was a delicate dance, one of boundaries slowly moving inward. By evening, Grace returned briefly with an extra blanket and a thermos of soup. The sunset bled red across the snowfields, and the wind had softened to a sigh. When she knocked again, Eli opened the door quicker this time. "You trying to get frostbite on my porch?" Grace grinned. "Just checking if your guests still bite." She knelt beside the pups, who were now asleep in a tight bundle. "You're good with them," she said softly. "You've got steady hands." "Steady's all that's left of me," Eli said, a wry note in his voice. Grace looked around the cabin. The neatness, the old tools arranged with military precision, the single rocking chair facing the window. "It's been a while since anyone breathed in here, huh?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "Until last night." She smiled, that same half-smile of someone who's seen too much pain to waste words on it. "Then maybe this is the start of something." She placed her scarf on the chair before leaving. "Keep it. You'll need it more than I do." After she left, the cabin felt both emptier and fuller. Guardian lifted her head, eyes tracking the door, then rested again. Eli sat back down, watching the fire. He reached for the honey jar and turned it slowly in his hands, the golden light catching the flame. "She said it saves the weak," he murmured. "Guess we'll see." Outside, the storm had left behind a world of stillness. Inside, something fragile, faith perhaps, began to thaw. When the last ember faded, Eli whispered into the quiet, "Chua vano juong jen Ravenhill." The dog stirred, her tail brushing the floor once, like an amen. Ravenhill Valley, 2 days after the storm, gleamed like glass beneath a winter sun. The light refracted off the snowfields, sharp as a blade. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin. It entered it, whispering through bone and thought. The mountains lay hushed, but the silence felt uneasy, as if something beneath the snow was breathing wrong. Inside the cabin, Eli Turner was bent over a wooden table, cleaning his old hunting rifle. Not because he planned to use it, but because some habits survived longer than wars. Guardian, the German shepherd, lay near the door, her amber eyes fixed on him, her tail still but ready. The pups, whom Eli had half-jokingly named Scout and Tiny, slept in a wool-lined crate by the hearth, twitching in their dreams. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, thawed broth, and faint animal musk. Eli liked it. It was a smell of life, of something besides solitude, but something else gnawed at the edges of his calm, the memory of what he'd seen at dawn. Footprints, human ones. They circled the cabin, shallow but deliberate, pressing through the fresh snow that had fallen during the night. Whoever had made them hadn't come close to the windows, but had stopped near the chimney, as if observing. That wasn't random, that was intent. Eli stood, walked to the window, and stared out across the valley. The world looked pure, almost holy, but he knew better. In his time, he'd learned that evil liked to hide behind beauty. Guardian followed his gaze, ears pricked, muscles tensed. "You saw it too," Eli murmured. "We're not alone out here." He wasn't paranoid. He was trained. He'd spent years tracking men by the way snow fell into their footprints, how branches bent, how silence changed shape. And this silence had changed. Around midday, Grace Holloway arrived, leading her brown mare along the ridge. She dismounted, her breath visible in thin white clouds, and waved when she saw Eli at the door. "You always watch visitors through a scope, or am I special?" she called out, smiling wryly. Eli smirked. "You knock, you get a door. You sneak, you get a scope." She led her horse to the post, brushing its mane. "There's talk down in town," she said. "Some hunters passing through last week, not from around here. Sheriff said they were headed north, but their truck tracks stopped near the forest road." Eli's brow furrowed. "Traps?" Grace nodded grimly. "Found 2 on my land this morning. Industrial kind. Steel jaws, heavy springs. Whoever set them knew what they were doing. Not for rabbits, Eli, for deer. Maybe worse." He glanced at Guardian, whose ears flicked at the word traps. "That's how she got that scar," he muttered. Grace exhaled, the sound fogging the air. "Then maybe she knows more about those men than we do." The rest of the day passed in cautious motion. Eli gathered his tools. An old camera, a weather radio, extra, batteries. Grace drew maps on a piece of scrap paper, marking where she'd found the traps. It was a strange partnership. 2 people who'd learned to live alone now, working side by side like they'd done it all their lives. When the sun began to dip, Eli stepped out to chop more firewood. The world had that fragile pink hue only winter sunsets know. Beautiful, but borrowed. That was when he realized Guardian was gone. The pups were awake, whining softly. The door, which he'd latched, now hung slightly ajar. Snow blew in through the crack. Eli grabbed his coat, his boots, and followed the trail of paw prints into the forest. The air was knife-sharp. The snow squeaked beneath his steps. He followed the tracks for nearly half a mile down a ridge where the pines thickened. And then he saw her, Guardian, dragging something behind her. It wasn't a carcass, not exactly. It was a long strip of frozen deer meat, bound with wire at one end, the flesh stiff as stone. She tugged it steadily, her movements slow but determined. When she reached him, she dropped it at his feet and sat down, panting, eyes flicking between him and the forest behind. Eli crouched. "You brought this?" he asked softly. The wire glinted in the fading light. It was the kind used in traps, industrial, rusted, unmistakable. "They're close," he muttered. He stared at the meat, then at her. She'd risked her life to pull it away. To bring food to her pups, yes, but also to warn him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then a quiet laugh escaped him, half disbelief, half admiration. "You've got more discipline than half the Marines I've known." He carried the frozen strip back to the cabin, Guardian padding silently beside him. When they reached the porch, Grace was there, feeding the fire in a metal barrel she'd set outside. She turned when she saw them. "Good Lord," she said. "She dragged that?" Eli nodded, placing it on the step. "Left over from a poacher's bait line. She pulled it off a trap chain." Grace crouched to inspect it, her breath misting the air. "Smart girl. She's saving her own. And maybe us too." Guardian stood watchful, chest heaving, snow melting on her fur. In the glow of the fire, she looked regal, scarred but magnificent, the kind of creature you'd trust more than most men. Eli rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "They'll come back for what's theirs. Then we'll be ready," Grace said simply. He looked at her, at the calm steel in her voice, and realized that, somewhere between the storm and this moment, the isolation he'd clung to had cracked. Grace wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was part of the defense. That night, while the pups slept, Eli and Grace sat near the fire, planning what to do if the men returned. No talk of guns, just light, visibility, signals, smart defense, not bloodshed. They agreed to alert the ranger station by radio at first light. Before Grace left, she glanced toward Guardian. "She's not just a dog," she said. "She's a soldier." Eli smiled faintly. "Then she's in good company." When she was gone, the cabin dimmed again, filled with the soft crackle of logs and the steady breathing of life. Eli sat watching Guardian clean her pups, one eye half closed from exhaustion, the other still scanning the dark window as if guarding the perimeter. He reached for the tin box beneath his bed, the one sealed for years, marked with dust and memory. Inside, wrapped in an old handkerchief, lay a metal dog tag with the inscription, Rex, USMC K9 Division. Rex had been his partner in the desert, a German shepherd who'd once dragged Eli out of a collapsed bunker after an explosion. The dog had died in his arms before the medevac arrived. Eli had kept the tag ever since, but never spoken his name aloud again. He looked at Guardian now, her strength, her loyalty, the same unwavering focus. Something stirred inside him, an ache that wasn't pain, but recognition. "You've got his eyes," he whispered. Guardian glanced up, ears twitching, as if she'd heard a name she'd known all along. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faint echo of bells from the town's distant church. Eli closed the tin box gently, then stood, crossing to the door. The snow glowed faintly under the moon. No movement, no threat. Only silence. But he knew better now. In Ravenhill, silence wasn't empty. It watched. He latched the door, checked the pups one last time, then sat beside the fire. Guardian lifted her head, and their eyes met. Soldier to soldier, survivor to survivor. "You brought the world back in with you," he murmured. "Now let's see if we can keep it safe." The fire cracked, sending sparks upward like tiny prayers. Outside, the snow fell again, erasing footprints but not intentions. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in the cold hollow of the forest, a trap clicked shut. Empty this time. The cold came back to Ravenhill that evening, sharper than before. Not as a storm this time, but as a silence with teeth. The forest looked harmless in the pale dusk, snow-laden branches hanging heavy, the air so still that you could hear a twig snap half a mile away. But for Eli Turner, the quiet wasn't peace. It was waiting. Inside the cabin, the fire cast a warm amber glow across the wood-paneled walls. Guardian, the German shepherd, dozed near the pups, her ears twitching even in sleep. The pups had grown stronger in 2 days. They now stumbled around the hearth like explorers discovering a new world. Eli had spent the morning sealing the window gaps with old cloth, refitting the door latch, and trimming the pine outside so he could see further into the tree line. At dusk, Grace Holloway arrived with a lantern in hand, and snow dusted across her parka. "You haven't been answering the radio," she said, stepping inside. "Had me thinking those hunters came back." Eli looked up from the table where he was sharpening a kitchen knife, not for combat, but comfort. "Batteries died," he said, setting the blade down. "And maybe I wanted a quiet day." Grace glanced around. The cabin looked different now, alive. A stew simmered on the stove. The pups chased each other clumsily over a blanket. "You're nesting," she teased softly. "Don't spread rumors," Eli replied, though the faintest smirk tugged at his mouth. Grace laughed under her breath, then her tone softened. "The sheriff's still looking for those poachers. They think it's the same group that's been working the state line. One of them's got a scar running from his cheek to his jaw." Eli stilled. "A scar?" "Yeah, big one. Why?" But before he could answer, something, a vibration more than a sound, rippled through the floorboards. Guardian's head shot up, ears pointed toward the door. A second later came 3 knocks. Not frantic, not desperate, steady, measured. The same rhythm Eli had heard the night he met Guardian. Grace froze. Her hand went instinctively to the revolver holstered at her hip. "That's not good." Eli's voice dropped low, calm as steel. "Stay back." He moved toward the door, every muscle remembering old drills. He opened it just enough to see the man standing outside. Tall, broad, wrapped in a torn hunting jacket dusted with snow. His face was weathered, the skin darkened by windburn, and across his right cheek ran a scar, deep and jagged, pulling the corner of his mouth into a half-smile that never reached his eyes. "Evenin'," the man said. His voice was gravel soaked in whiskey. "Didn't mean to startle you, sir. Storm caught me up north, just looking to warm up by a fire." Eli's gaze flicked to the man's boots, thick, heavy, the kind that left the same prints he'd seen near the chimney days ago. He looked down again. On the man's glove was a faint rust. Smear, blood, or bait. "You alone?" Eli asked. "Always am," the man said, grin widening. "Nice dog you got there. Shepherd, right? Smart breed. Valuable, too." Guardian growled low, a sound like a cello string stretched to breaking. She stepped between Eli and the open door, teeth bared but not lunging. The man chuckled. "Ain't she a beauty? Shame if something happened to her." Eli's eyes hardened. "You can warm yourself at the ranger station 12 miles south. They've got coffee and laws." "Now, that's unfriendly," the man said, shifting his weight. His right hand stayed inside his coat pocket too long, too deliberate. "Didn't peg you for the territorial type." Grace moved silently behind the stove, hand hovering near her revolver. "We don't sell warmth here," she said evenly. The man's eyes slid toward her, then back to Eli. "Well, that's a pity." He smiled again, a cold, crooked thing. "You folks take care now." He stepped back into the dusk. His boots crunched softly, leaving a trail of dark impressions on the snow. Eli waited until the figure disappeared behind the trees, then closed the door and slid the wooden bolt into place. The silence that followed was suffocating. Only the fire cracked. Grace exhaled, shoulders dropping. "That's him, isn't it? The one with the traps." Eli nodded slowly. "And he knows what's in here now." Guardian was still facing the door, her stance rigid, ears tilted toward the night. Grace crossed her arms, thinking. "He was testing you, seeing if you'd flinch." "He won't have to wonder next time," Eli muttered. Grace frowned. "Don't do anything stupid." "I won't," Eli said. Then, quieter, "Not unless I have to." They sat for a while, saying nothing. The pups settled down again, curling into each other like small flames. Outside, wind whispered across the cabin walls. Grace stood, pulling her scarf tighter. "I'll head back before dark thickens. I'll bring more batteries tomorrow. You, keep that door locked." "I plan to," he said. "And Grace, thanks." "For what?" "For standing between me and stupid." She smiled faintly. "Someone's got to do it." When she left, the cold swallowed the sound of her horse hooves almost immediately. The world narrowed to the glow of the cabin and the watchful gleam of Guardian's eyes. Eli sat by the window, watching the tree line until the last light drained from the sky. Every shadow seemed to move. Every whisper of snow sounded like footsteps. He tried to read, then gave up and returned to the fire. Guardian came to sit beside him, pressing her head lightly against his knee. Her fur was warm, grounding. "You're not just guarding them, are you?" he said softly. "You're guarding me." Her ears flicked. She looked up at him, as if to say, "Then stay awake." He did. Through the night, he listened to the groaning pines, to the soft breathing of the pups, to the invisible weight of eyes beyond the window. Just after midnight, a sound, distant but deliberate, cracked the stillness, metal against wood. Not close, but near enough. Eli stood, went to the window, and peered through the slit in the curtain. A faint light flickered deep in the woods. Not firelight, but the brief flare of a match. Someone was out there. He didn't wake Grace. Didn't radio the Rangers. Not yet. He sat back down, hand resting on Guardian's head. "We wait," he whispered. "If he's testing us, let's see how we score." The dog's tail brushed the floor once, slow and steady, like a drumbeat of understanding. Outside, snow began to fall again. Silent, endless, beautiful. It covered the man's footprints, but not the memory of his grin. When dawn finally arrived, the cabin still stood, intact but changed. The test had begun, and both man and dog knew the next knock would not be for warmth. The next day broke with a deceptive calm, the kind that in Ravenhill always meant something was coming. The air was crisp, still, almost painfully clear, so clear that the sound of a crow taking off from the trees echoed like glass shattering. Eli Turner stood on the porch of his cabin, surveying the snowfield stretching into the pines. Everything looked undisturbed, yet he felt watched, the way a soldier does before an ambush. Inside, Grace Holloway had arrived early, her scarf drawn tight against her neck. The revolver she carried stayed hidden beneath her jacket, but Eli knew her hand could reach it in a blink. She moved with quiet efficiency, pulling lengths of thin wire from her satchel and small bells she'd brought from her ranch. "I use these on my sheep pens," she said, looping a bell around a post by the porch. "The wind won't trigger them, but feet will, even light ones." Eli helped her tie them around the cabin perimeter, a crude early warning system, but better than nothing. "You always carry church bells to a gunfight?" he asked dryly. Grace smiled faintly. "Noise keeps wolves away, whether they walk on 4 legs or 2. He couldn't argue with that. By mid-afternoon, they'd finished circling the cabin. The pups slept by the fire, their bellies round, and Guardian sat upright by the door, eyes fixed on the tree line. The wind had picked up, moaning softly across the ridge, a sound like breath through a hollow pipe. Grace poured them each a cup of strong tea, her movements calm but taut. "The sheriff's men won't reach this high until morning," she said. "The roads are iced. Then it's just us till then." Eli checked the lantern batteries and his camera. "We'll light him up, not shoot him. Get his face on tape. Let the law do its job." Grace nodded, though her eyes betrayed uncertainty. "You think he'll come back tonight?" He didn't walk through a storm to knock for manners. The daylight waned. Shadows lengthened over the snow, and the forest turned from blue to indigo to black. When the last light died, they extinguished the lamps inside, leaving only the faint glow of the fireplace, its smoke slipping through the chimney like a prayer. Eli and Grace moved quietly through the cabin, each motion deliberate. He positioned the lanterns just out of sight of the door, their wicks trimmed but unlit, while Grace crouched near the window with her camera. The air was cold enough that their breath misted even indoors. "Stay close to the pups," Eli whispered. "If anything happens, get them to the back." Grace nodded, her jaw tightening. "And you?" He gave a half smile. "I'll open the door." Outside, the world was a black ocean of snow. The moon had not yet risen, and the sky was thick with low, ghostly clouds. The bells, those small, fragile guardians of the night, hung motionless in the still air. Then, at exactly midnight, one of them chimed, a single delicate clang, so soft it might have been imagined. Guardian's head snapped up, her fur bristled. Eli froze, eyes cutting toward the door. A second bell rang, closer, then another. A chain of faint metallic notes moving slowly along the side of the cabin. "He's circling," Grace breathed. Eli moved to the door and positioned himself behind it, hand near the latch. The sound of snow crunching outside was faint but deliberate, someone moving with practiced caution, the kind of stealth that came from years of doing wrong. Guardian stood at the ready, body low, tail stiff, her gaze locked on the doorway. The pups whimpered softly, sensing the shift in the air. Eli motioned for Grace to start the camera. The soft red light blinked alive in her hand. The footsteps stopped, then silence, and suddenly, a creak. The porch board nearest the door groaned under weight. Eli's voice was steady, calm as an old hymn. "Now!" He threw open the door. The lantern light blazed outward in a flood of orange, cutting through the dark like a blade. Snow glittered in the sudden glare, revealing the outline of a man crouched near the wall, the scarred stranger from before. His eyes flashed in the light, wild and cornered. In his hand, a steel trap half opened, glinting. "Easy," Eli said, raising a hand. "You're trespassing on private land, caught on camera, and surrounded by witnesses." Grace stepped into view, voice calm and deliberate. "You're being recorded," she said. "Drop it. Walk away." For a second, the man didn't move. His breath steamed in quick bursts, eyes flicking between them. Then Guardian growled, deep, resonant, warning. The man's jaw tightened. He spat into the snow. "You don't know what you're getting into." Eli's expression didn't change. "Oh, I do. You're caught. Walk away." The stranger's hand twitched around the trap handle, then released. The metal jaws snapped shut on empty air with a vicious clang. The sound rang across the valley, echoing through the trees like gunfire. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the man turned and bolted toward the trees. His boots struck the bells on the porch, setting off a cascade of chiming that rang out across the snowfield. Bright, defiant, beautiful. Grace exhaled shakily, camera still rolling. "Got him," she whispered. Eli closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, as his breath caught up to his heart. "No gunfire, no blood," he said softly. "That's enough." Grace nodded, a tremor of relief breaking through her composure. "I think those bells worked better than bullets." A smile ghosted across his face. "Cheaper, too." She laughed, half nerves, half triumph, and sank into a chair. The pups had curled back into sleep, unaware of the war their protectors had just won. Eli crossed the room, adjusting the lantern's flame lower until only a warm glow filled the cabin. Guardian settled again near the door, her chest rising in slow, steady breaths. "Think he'll come back?" Grace asked. "No," Eli said, staring at the window where the last snowflake melted against the glass. "He saw something tonight he couldn't buy." "What's that?" Eli looked toward the wooden cross above the fireplace. "Light." For a while, neither spoke. The storm outside was gone. The forest had gone still again, this time in peace, not dread. Grace broke the quiet with a tired smile. "You ever think maybe you weren't meant to live up here alone?" Eli chuckled softly. "You sound like my mother." "She sounds like a smart woman." "She was, and stubborn, like you." Grace stood, pulling on her coat. "Then I'll take that as a compliment. I'll head back before morning light. Sheriff will get the footage tomorrow." Eli walked her to the door. "You sure you'll be okay alone down there?" Grace smiled. "After tonight, I think the Lord's on our watch list." He nodded, and for a moment they stood together, listening to the faint echo of bells swaying in the breeze, soft, harmless now, but still there. When she disappeared into the silver distance, Eli turned back to the cabin. Guardian met his eyes, tail thumping once. "Good girl," he said, kneeling beside her. "You did your part." She pressed her nose against his hand, and for the first time in years, Eli felt something he thought he'd buried in desert sand long ago. Trust. The night had tested them all, man, woman, and dog, and none had faltered. Outside, The bells kept ringing faintly, not as a warning anymore, but as the sound of safety. Morning came gently to Ravenhill, not as a burst of light, but as a slow, merciful easing of darkness. The first rays crept through the pines, glinting off the snow like scattered shards of glass. Inside the cabin, the air was still warm from the night's fire. Eli Turner sat at the table, a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hand, his eyes distant. The bells outside clinked lightly in the morning breeze, no longer signals of fear, but of peace. The pups had grown bolder overnight. Scout gnawed on the edge of Eli's boot, while Tiny tumbled clumsily across the floorboards. Guardian, ever watchful, let them play but kept a mother's gaze fixed on the window. Her eyes were clearer now, her ribs less pronounced, her coat returning to a healthy sheen. She looked reborn, not just a survivor, but something sacred. Grace Holloway knocked softly before stepping in. She'd been up since dawn, riding from her ranch with her hair dusted in frost and her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. "They caught him," she said simply. Eli looked up. "The poacher?" "Tracked him by tire marks down the valley. Ranger found his traps packed and ready. He's not coming back." A quiet relief washed through the room. Eli leaned back in his chair. "Good." Grace smiled faintly. "Looks like your bells did half the sheriff's work." "They did the Lord's," Eli said with a small grin. "Maybe we'll keep them up for decoration." Grace crouched to pet the pups. "They're stronger." "They're survivors," Eli replied. His tone carried quiet pride. "Takes one to raise one." The light through the frosted window turned soft and gold, the kind that made even scars look kind. Grace stood and brushed snow from her coat. "There's something else," she said. "A sound, near the ridge, faint, like a whimper. Thought it was a fox at first." Guardian's head lifted instantly. Her ears perked toward the door, nostrils flaring. "You heard it too?" Eli asked her, half smiling. The dog gave a low rumble, not a growl, but a statement. "I think we should check it," Grace said. Eli reached for his coat and gloves. "Then let's move before the sun softens the snow." They stepped outside into the crystalline morning. The world glittered like a cathedral of frost. Their breaths came out in steady white clouds as they followed Guardian down the narrow trail that curved behind the cabin, through the pines and toward the valley ridge. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots. Guardian stopped often, nose to the wind, tail stiff. Then, near a hollow tree that had fallen long ago, she began to bark, low at first, then sharper, urgent. Eli hurried ahead, brushed away a mound of snow, and froze. Two tiny shapes lay curled against the roots, puppies, barely alive, half buried beneath a blanket of ice and pine needles. Their fur was dull, their breathing faint. One gave a weak whimper. The other didn't move. Grace knelt beside him, her gloved hands trembling slightly. "Not hers?" Eli shook his head. "Different scent." But she found them. Guardian stepped forward, licking the frost from their faces, nudging gently until one stirred. The other remained limp. She whined softly, the sound aching with sorrow. Eli's jaw tightened. "She's asking for help." Without hesitation, he unzipped his coat and gathered both pups inside, holding them against his chest. Their tiny bodies were weightless, fragile, but a faint pulse fluttered beneath his palm. "Come on," he whispered, voice rough. "Not today." They hurried back through the snow, Guardian trotting beside them, her breath steaming. By the time they reached the cabin, Eli's arms had gone numb, but the pups were still alive, barely. Grace moved swiftly, lighting the stove and heating a small pot of milk. "You take one," she said, handing him a towel. "Keep it warm." Eli nodded, sitting by the fire, rubbing the smaller pup's sides, coaxing life back into its body. Guardian lay close, nose pressed against them, her eyes pleading and determined all at once. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, faintly, one of the pups squeaked. Eli exhaled, his shoulders slumping. The sound was small, but it was enough. Grace laughed softly, wiping her eyes. "You did it." Eli shook his head. "She did it." He looked at Guardian, who now nudged the tiny body with the gentleness of a saint. They fed the pups slowly, drop by drop, until both moved weakly but alive. The cabin, once again, filled with that fragile symphony of breathing and tiny sounds, a living warmth that no fire could match. Later, when the sun reached its peak, Grace stood by the window, watching the light dance off the bells outside. "You ever think," she said quietly, "that maybe the Lord sends trials not to break us, but to gather us?" Eli smiled. "Or to make us listen." He rose, went to the shelf, and took down the tin box he hadn't touched since the night before. The metal was cold, its surface scratched from years of neglect. He opened it, revealing the dog tag. Rex, USMC K9 Division. Grace watched silently as Eli knelt beside Guardian. "He saved me once," Eli said, voice low. "Pulled me out when the bunker collapsed. Died before I could thank him." He looked into Guardian's amber eyes, seeing the same loyalty there, the same courage. "You've kept the whole forest safe. Guess it's my turn to keep you." He reached forward and fastened the tag gently around her neck. The metal glinted in the light, not as a chain, but as a covenant. Guardian stood still, tail low, understanding something sacred had passed between them. Grace smiled through a quiet sigh. "Now she has her medal." Eli nodded. "She earned it." Outside, the faint rumble of an engine echoed through the trees. The ranger's truck. Eli stepped out to greet them, the cold biting his face. Two officers climbed out, saluting briefly. "Morning, sir. We got your footage. Poacher's in custody. His traps are being cleared from the ridge." "Good," Eli said simply. "The mountain's seen enough blood." The ranger nodded. "You folks did right. Most wouldn't have handled it that way." Eli glanced back at the cabin, where light poured through the window, and 6 small shapes, Guardian and her pups, moved softly against the floor. "Sometimes," he said, "all you need's a bit of light and a few bells." When the rangers drove off, the world fell silent again. But it wasn't the old silence of loneliness. It was peace. Eli returned inside, poured 2 mugs of coffee, and handed one to Grace. "To new mornings," he said. She lifted the cup, smiling. "And to second chances." He chuckled. "You think we've earned them?" Grace looked around the cabin, the fire, the dogs, the cross on the wall. "We didn't earn them," she said softly. "We were given them." Outside, the snow began to melt under the rising sun. Drops of water fell from the roof, catching light like tears of joy. Eli watched through the window as Guardian led the pups toward the door, the tag on her neck glinting like a beacon. He opened the door wide, letting the morning air flow in. The forest smelled clean, reborn. Guardian turned back once, meeting his gaze. He smiled, hand resting on the wooden cross. "Welcome home, Guardian." The camera, if it had still been rolling, would have pulled back then. Wide, sweeping, showing the valley awakening after long winter. Smoke curling from the chimney, bells swaying gently in the breeze, and footprints leading not away, but toward the light. The storm had passed, leaving behind not ruin, but revelation. Some storms break us. Others bring us home. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive in thunder or light, but in the quiet knock of a stranger or the soft eyes of a creature that chooses to trust again. Eli thought he was saving a dog that night, but through Guardian, God was really saving him. In our lives too, blessings often come in small forms, hidden inside storms we wish would pass. So, if you've ever felt lost, remember that faith still finds its way through the snow. Share this story to remind someone that light always returns, even after the coldest night. Leave a comment and tell us what part touched your heart. And if you believe in the quiet miracles of God, type Amen below. May God bless you and keep you warm in every storm to come. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more hearts can find their way home.